When paramedics arrived at the modest Arizona home, they found Dale in bed, his skull shattered, blood soaking the sheets, and his wife screaming that an intruder had attacked them. But the story didn't quite make sense. She kept going back and forth, and investigators soon came to realise that the crime scene evidence was telling a very different story. It was just after 2:30 in the morning when the first 911 call came through. The dispatcher answered, "911, what's your emergency?" And what came back was disjointed, panicked, a woman's voice jerky and erratic, scrambling for words. She said, something's wrong." The dispatcher tried again. "What's your emergency, ma'am?" "Something's happened, I don't know." And then the line went dead. The call reconnected moments later. This time, the woman was more hysterical, her voice cracking. "I need help, he was hurting me." The dispatcher tried again. "Can you tell me what happened? Who attacked you?" Then, a confession, sort of. "He was raping me, I was fighting, I grabbed a hammer and hit him, and then I put it down and Stan hit him with a hammer. Oh my God." Then silence. Again, the call dropped. Another call, same dispatcher, same calm question. "911, what's your emergency?" The same voice, erratic, replied, "I don't know what happened. He was attacking me. He was trying to strangle me. There was a hammer. Are they coming?" "Yes, ma'am," the dispatcher said. "Can you tell me what happened?" The line went dead again, but this time police were on their way. This is Red Rum, stories about the true victims of crime. I upload on Mondays and Thursdays, so make sure you're subscribed so you never miss an episode. For this episode, I've used the book Brain Damage, A Juror's Tale, The Hammer Killing by Paul Sanders. And it really is an amazing account from a juror's perspective, so there is a ton of information on this one. It's going to be a two-parter with both parts out right now. And there's a lot of quotes from transcripts and videos, so I'm not going to be quoting and unquoting, but you will be able to tell when that happens. Okay, with that said, strap in because this one is horrific. When the first police car pulled up to the street of homes in Gilbert, Arizona, the scene that met them was chaos. A woman, barefoot, blood-soaked, wearing a torn t-shirt, stood in the driveway sobbing. Her hands clutched a flip phone, the same one used to call 911, and as the officer approached, she threw the phone down onto the pavement and began wailing. She had a faint cut across her forehead and blood streaked down her neck and arms. She was speaking in fragments, disjointed, impossible to follow, hysterical. Inside the house, another officer spotted a man emerging from the shadows, calm, silent, hands raised. The officer ordered him to stay still and then carefully patted him down and found a handgun in his pocket. The man said his name was Stan. He was compliant, quiet. Inside the home, Officer Ryan Churchman entered cautiously, gun drawn. The house was dark, eerily so, except for one lit room at the end of the hallway. He passed by closed doors one room at a time, and he saw that one room had two small children inside, asleep, undisturbed. Another door opened to reveal a 13-year-old girl awake and very confused. She asked what was going on, and the officer told her to stay in her room and that they would advise her later. And then he gently closed the door. He moved towards the open, glowing room, and that is when he saw it. A naked man was collapsed on the floor, blood covering his face, neck, and head. It was everywhere, spattered across the bed, soaking the pillow, pooled on the carpet. His head was bent at a really unnatural angle, and he was slumped awkwardly between the dresser and the mattress. For a split second, Officer Churchman thought that maybe this was a suicide, a shotgun blast, but no weapon was visible, just the damage, and it was brutal. He knelt beside the man, later confirmed to be Dale Harrell, and he tried to locate the source of the bleeding. There was this massive decompression in his skull. One eye socket was swollen completely shut. The officer grabbed a cloth and pressed it against Dale's head, but the wound was soft, fragmented, and blood just kind of poured out freely. There was no time to wait. He radioed for medical urgently. Another officer, Chris Dorenbush, rushed to his trunk, his boot, and retrieved a digital camera. They needed evidence fast before the scene got disturbed by emergency crews. He snapped what pictures he could. Dale's mangled body, the bloodied bed, and hammer. It was lying almost casually on a table near the entrance of the room. I don't know, I probably would never have a hammer lying around, but I am not a DIY girly. But maybe in a family house, it could be seen as innocent at a glance. But this hammer was soaked in blood, and it had been used with chilling intent. Outside, the deep rumble of a fire engine echoed down the street. Paramedics pulled a gurney towards the front door. Officer Gibson, meanwhile, was trying to get coherent answers from this woman in the driveway, Marissa. He asked if she could tell him her name, and she replied, Marissa. Who's the black man? The officer asked, gesturing back towards Stan. Quote, that's Stan, he's a roommate. He's my saviour, he saved my life. The officer asked how, and Marissa replied, I don't know. I was being choked, and he saved me. Who was choking you? My husband, Dale. Are there 3 children inside? Marissa nodded. 3 kids, we have 3 kids. She named them one by one through the tears. Inside the house, 13-year-old Rhiannon, Marissa's daughter, was wide awake now. She'd been having a strange dream. She thought she'd heard someone saying, Dale, buddy, wake up, stay with me, but it was just past 2:30 a.m. and she was groggy and confused. Earlier that night, they'd gone out as a family to get hot chocolate. She was grounded at the time, something about a boy and a notebook and a school complaint, but her parents had seemed cool about it. She thought maybe things were finally getting better. She'd rubbed her eyes and tried to go back to sleep, but then came the sound of wheels on the tile floor. Mumbling voices, a strange clanking. Then a police officer standing in her doorway. The officer asked, are you okay? And she replied, yes, but she was confused. Well, you would be, wouldn't you? Waking up to a weird dream and then strange sounds and suddenly a police officer opening your bedroom door. The officer asked, what's your name? And she replied, Rhiannon. He went on, how old are you? 13. I need you to stay here with the door closed, okay? She nodded. The door clicked shut. Back outside the house, Marissa DeVault was placed in the back of a patrol car to stay warm. Her cries were guttural, raw. She clutched her body, rocking slightly as officers tried to get a clear version of what happened inside that home, but her answers were scattered to say the least. Her first story was a chilling one. An intruder had broken into their house in the dead of night. This mysterious figure, unknown and violent, had stormed into their home with a hammer, attacking Dale in a brutal, unprovoked assault. Melissa claimed she woke up to the chaos, terrified and confused, unable to stop what was happening, but the police found no signs of forced entry. No broken windows, no pried open doors, nothing to suggest that a stranger had slipped inside. No fingerprints, no footprints, no eyewitnesses. The roommate Stan Cook was silent, at least for now, and the supposed attacker was nowhere to be found. The story, as dramatic as it sounded, began to unravel under scrutiny. It didn't fit the physical evidence and it didn't fit the facts. And Marissa's story quickly shifted. This time, she said her roommate Stan Cook had been the one attacking Dale, but it wasn't a straightforward act of violence, rather part of a complex and volatile situation inside the household. Marissa described Stan as family, someone she'd known for years and someone who had a brain injury from a past crash. She portrayed him as generally sweet and non-violent, someone who had witnessed Dale's abusive behaviour but usually stayed out of it. So Stan wasn't attacking out of malice, but instead to stop Dale from choking and raping Marissa. According to her, on the night of the attack, she'd woken up to find Dale on top of her, choking her. She was terrified, struggling to breathe, and blacked out at one point. During this chaos, Marissa recalled suddenly having a hammer in her hands and striking Dale, shouting, "You don't own me," before hitting him again. Then, according to her, Stan appeared, grabbed the hammer from her and started attacking Dale. Marissa was disorientated. She was distraught. But what stood out about her most was just how vague, and yet strangely specific, her recollections were. Paramedics had soon arrived and they'd begun to check her vitals. One noted mild redness on her neck, but not much else. When they asked where she was hurt, Marissa listed off a number of places: her legs, her back, her head. She kept asking about Dale, whether he was going to be okay, whether he was still alive. One of the officers handed her a mobile phone, her daughter's. Marissa took it, dialed her mother and burst into tears. She asked her to come immediately. She needed help with the kids. And that was the first scene the responders walked into that night. A man lying in bed, beaten within inches of his life. A hammer lying nearby, blood soaked into the mattress, the walls, the carpet, and in the driveway, a weeping wife, a silent roommate, and a story that just didn't add up. Hours later, Marissa was inside a small police interview room. She sat hunched, her legs curled up beneath her, her hands twisting together in her lap. Across from her sat Detective Brenda Tomery. She remained steady and calm, her tone unwavering as she began to ask the most important question of all: what really happened? Marissa began to talk. She said she had been asleep when Dale attacked her. She believed they'd had sex, though she couldn't remember it clearly. Something about the way she felt afterwards made her believe that it had happened. And then she said that his hands were around her neck. She described Dale as someone who forced sex regularly. That's how she actually describes it. Obviously, I don't need to say this, but the words for that is rape. But actually, we'll come on to Marissa's thoughts on that, with Dale being her husband, in just a moment. Marissa went on, describing how Dale choked her when she was no fun. She said it happened multiple times a week and that she didn't feel like she had a choice. As the interview unfolded, she began to paint a history of abuse. She said Dale had broken her collarbone, scratched her eye, slammed her into a wall hard enough to create a hole. And when asked, she admitted that this had all happened, but she'd never filed a report, except for one time, years ago, but even then, she claimed she'd helped Dale cover it up before police arrived. Detective Tomery kept pressing. She needed to understand what led to that moment, the one where Dale was found nearly dead in his bed. Marissa said that it had been a quiet night, hot chocolate with her daughter, cigarettes in the garage. Stan, the roommate, came out to talk. Then Dale appeared briefly, wearing those red plaid or checkered shorts that she always hated. Everyone eventually went back inside and Dale went to bed. She smoked one last cigarette. Then, she said, she joined Dale in bed and soon fell asleep. But when she woke up, it was because he was choking her. At some point, she claimed she screamed and ran. When she came back, Stan was holding the hammer. She said she didn't know where the hammer had come from, and to me that is a bit odd. Like, you're going to know if a hammer is lying around, aren't you? It's not like it's a I don't know, like a pair of scissors or something, something you're way more normal to find inside your house, maybe misplaced from the kitchen into the bedroom. But a hammer, I don't know. As I said, I'm really not a DIY kind of person, but that seemed to be off. Anyway, Marissa said that maybe it had been left out after she hung a picture, maybe. After that happened, she said she was disoriented, shaking, and that she told Stan to slap her to come back to reality. Detective Tomery continued to question the inconsistencies. There were no signs of Dale being angry earlier that night. Why hadn't anyone else heard an argument? And why did Marissa's version keep shifting? Marissa insisted that Dale had snapped, that it all just happened so fast and she couldn't explain it. But even as she told her version of events, Detective Tomery could sense it. Something was off, because despite the chaos inside that house, despite the carnage in the bedroom, the one thing that seemed to be missing was the truth. At that point, the door to the interrogation room opened. A new figure stepped in, Detective Cy Ray. His tone was calm, measured, a stark contrast to the intensity of earlier questioning. Marissa looked up at him and her posture changed. She seemed relieved, almost eager to connect. "You look familiar," she said, trying to find common ground, but there was no shared history, only the performance of one. He said, "Marissa, we understand you've been through a lot. I want you to know your kids are safe. They're with your mum in a hotel and Dale is in the hospital being treated." When the first attack occurred, police were working under the assumption that this was a domestic incident gone horribly wrong. A violent outburst, perhaps, but one that had ended in survival. Dale Harrell was clinging to life, so in those early hours, everything was processed as if it was an aggravated assault. Dale was in the intensive care unit at Mercy Gilbert Hospital. He lay unconscious, mutilated, and restrained by a web of surgical tape and breathing tubes. His body, once athletic, once active, was now limp beneath hospital sheets, wired to machines keeping him alive. Tubes protruded from his legs. His skull had been cut open in a last-ditch attempt to relieve pressure from the severe swelling in his brain. I'm going to quote this from a surgeon that later explained exactly what was going on. Quote, "The brain can asphyxiate itself if the swelling isn't controlled. We made a question mark type incision into the skull bone, removed large pieces of skull, and sealed the vessels to stop the bleeding. But the swelling was significant. We had to take out bone to give the brain space." What the scans revealed was horrifying. Dale had sustained a depressed skull fracture just behind the eye, the kind of injury that only comes from deliberate force. His right eye socket was crushed, the top portion of his jawbone was broken, and he had multiple hematomas and a contusion on the brain, and a partially avulsed ear. At least one of the blows had landed with such force that it fractured the skull in multiple places, sharp, fragmented pieces that could do further internal damage with any movement. Back at the house, the Gilbert Police Department had already started cataloguing every inch of the crime scene, not with the eyes of a homicide team, but with the careful neutrality of a domestic violence unit. Still, there were anomalies. We know there was no forced entry, and actually the ordering of this is a little off. It's reported in various different places as happening in different ways. And I've taken most of my info from that book I mentioned, but as for the order, just know it is not super clear in any of the sources. I guess what's important up to this point is that she said first there was an intruder, then it's changed and she was acting in self-defense, and actually Stan had protected her and he'd been the one to inflict those devastating blows. The detective said, "This is your opportunity to be fully honest with us. We're listening, but things at the scene don't line up with what you've said to us so far. If we're going to get to the truth, we're going to need your help." Marissa looked down. She didn't say anything. Then the door clicked shut again as Detective Ray left the room. By now, the detectives had spent hours with Melissa. They'd listened, they'd questioned, and they'd extended empathy, but there were cracks forming, and they were growing wider. That's when Detective Ray re-entered the room. He sat across from Marissa again and gently brought things back into focus. He said, "Marissa, we know that you've suffered 8 or 9 years of abuse, but like the other investigator said, things don't match what you're telling us." Marissa sat pretty motionless across from the detective, and her eyes at this time are like fixed on the floor. She just says nothing, and then, without a word, she reaches across the table, pulls the officer's notepad towards her and begins to write. And once she's done, she pushes the pad back towards him, and on it, there's a single sentence: "Husbands can't rape their wives." And with that, she broke down. She claimed she had been asleep when Dale climbed on top of her, but he was inside her. She had scratched and bitten him in a panic. She said Stan wasn't in the room, not at first, and somehow in the chaos, she ended up with a hammer in her hands. She couldn't remember how it got there, couldn't remember the moment it struck, only that she held it with both hands and swung, telling Dale that he didn't own her. She said Stan came in afterwards and that he was the one to stop her, that he took the hammer from her, and then nothing. Her voice kind of falters in the recording and she lowers her face into her palms and weeps. She added that Dale had ripped her shirt as he grabbed her. She wasn't trying to lie, she insisted. She didn't mean to kill him, but she was terrified, not just of what had happened, but of what was coming. If she went to prison, who was going to raise her daughters? It was a moment that revealed everything, but kind of resolved nothing. Because while Marissa's confession sounded like a breakthrough, detectives already knew that what she was describing still didn't match the physical evidence, and whether she was lying to cover for someone else, or lying to cover for herself, or telling bits of the truth, none of that was certain. All that was for sure was that the story had changed yet again, and this time she had placed the hammer in her own hands. The bloodied claw hammer was found in the master bedroom. It was sealed in a white plastic bag and then placed into cellophane evidence. It had been left on a nightstand, not hidden or discarded, just kind of sitting there in plain sight. One officer had managed to take blurry photos of Dale whilst he was still lying on the bedroom floor. As we know, he was naked, he was barely conscious, his head was pressed against the side of the nightstand and blood had been pooling around his torso. And those would all go into evidence which would eventually be presented at trial. But what really began to concern investigators was the blood spatter. It was on the walls, it was on the sheets, it was on Marissa, and when they looked at it closer, it just didn't match Marissa's story. The logistics were wrong. The sequence of events she'd offered didn't match the pattern of blood, the positioning of the weapon, the blunt force trauma. It was the opinion of the Gilbert Police Department that Dale had been lying down, possibly asleep when that first blow landed. And if that was true, this wasn't self-defense. This was premeditated. When detectives began pushing her on the inconsistencies, Marissa pivoted. It was on January 21st, 2009 that police had had enough and they decided to arrest Marissa for aggravated assault. And she cried in interviews, she described years of abuse, and to some extent, her shifting narratives did still garner sympathy. She was sticking to this story, clinging to the idea that this was about escaping a violent man, even as the evidence began pointing in another direction. And meanwhile, Dale was alive, but barely. And the severity of his injuries raised serious questions about the story Marissa had told. Detectives had already begun picking apart her shifting versions of events, and more inconsistencies were mounting. She was now taken into custody on suspicion of attempted murder, and she was held at the county jail. The charges were grave, and bail was initially denied. But as the investigation continued and Dale remained in a coma, Marissa's legal team pushed for release, and eventually she was granted bail and released under strict conditions. But all this time, the only thing keeping Dale alive was a ventilator. Marissa walked out of jail after posting a $250,000 bail. Money that didn't come from family or from friends or even from Stan Cook. It came from a man the detectives had only just started to hear about, Alan Flores. And when they looked into him, they realised this case was about to get even darker. Alan Flores was a man who prided himself on logic. A numbers guy with a career in supply chain management, he lived by structure, spreadsheets, forecasts and formulas. But in 2007, what he thought of as tidy little life collided with chaos when he logged onto a website called seekingarrangement.com. You might have heard about it, or maybe not. It's basically one of those websites where like sugar daddies meet sugar babies, women who want a bit of extra money, and men who can buy the illusion of intimacy, or at the very least, attention. According to Alan, he'd only logged back on with the intention of cancelling his account, but then he saw Marissa's account. The woman he'd seen in the profile photo was actually someone he recognised, and not from the internet, but from real life. He'd seen her at a local grocery store, Basher's, and again at a pizza place. It was the same woman now staring back at him from his laptop screen, Marissa DeVault. According to Alan, they met in person soon after. She told him she was a divorced mother of 3, struggling financially. That very night, they became physically intimate. And for Alan, that marked the beginning of something more than just a fling. He fell hard and fast. Within weeks, Alan began loaning Marissa money. First a few $100s for car repairs, then more, gas, groceries, water bills, mobile phone plans. He created detailed spreadsheets to track each loan. It's very clear that this exchange of money was not necessarily for services or for attention or for whatever the usual arrangement is on seekingarrangement.com. More so, this was a kind of loan arrangement, and whatever Marissa's reasons were for continuing to see Alan, it's clear that they also had some sort of romantic relationship on top of this. With those loans, he would eventually apply 2.5% monthly interest, so like 30% annually. I mean, this guy's got a ton of money, enough to just lend it out willy-nilly, but he is putting 30% interest on what he thinks is going to be going to a single mother who's struggling to feed her kids. I don't know, I'm obviously not saying Marissa's in the right here. We know she's not a single mother. Her husband Dale is at home, but anyway, you'll find out more about Alan later, and he's just not the greatest guy. Marissa did always promise to pay Alan back. She said her late father, Michael Wright, had left her $1.8 million inheritance, but it was all tied up in litigation. And Alan believed her. He began paying her mortgage, around $3,000 a month, despite never seeing any ownership documents. Marissa claimed the house was part of the same legal battle. He opened a joint bank account with her to help her organise her finances, but she rarely used that one. The excuses kept coming. Credit issues, banking errors, paperwork delays. Then, Alan discovered something. Marissa's father, Michael Wright, the man she claimed was dead, was very much alive. When confronted, Marissa pivoted. She said it was actually her grandmother's trust, not her father's. Another misunderstanding, she insisted, but Alan now had his doubts. One day, while Alan was attending the Gilbert rodeo, he called Marissa's house. Her roommate Stan Cook answered. He said Marissa and Dale, her ex, were out to dinner. Alan was confused. He thought Dale was gone, an abuser Marissa had escaped from. Unable to shake the feeling, Alan drove to the house, and there, in the front garden, was Dale, hanging Christmas lights up, holding a hammer. When Alan asked why Dale was there, Marissa would later tell him that Dale had lost his apartment and was staying with her temporarily. She insisted that she had a restraining order ready to remove him, and she needed $15,000 to help get him out for good. And Alan paid this money. I mean, come on, man. Obviously, we don't know what she's telling him exactly, but look at the evidence, man. He later did speak on this. He said he felt sorry for her, trapped between protecting her kids and fending off an abusive past. She even asked him to be the beneficiary of her will in case something happened to her, and he did agree. According to Alan, Marissa asked him for money to take Dale to a casino for his birthday. Alan was surprised. Why would she celebrate with an abuser? Marissa told him it was part of her plan to convince Dale to leave peacefully, and so Alan gave her the money. But not long after, Marissa said something else. Alan claimed that Marissa brought up an ex-boyfriend named Travis Tatro. And this is a bit of a story that I want you to put a pin in, and we will come back to it in part 2. It is important, but it's also a very short part. Travis was called to testify at the trial, the eventual trial, but he really doesn't have a huge amount to say, but what he does say is incredibly important. So we will come back to him a little bit later. So just to kind of clarify the money part of this, within just 30 days of meeting Alan, Marissa's borrowing had become somewhat uncontrollable. What started as a loan to fix her car quickly spiraled out of control. It wasn't long before Marissa's debts had ballooned to more than $250,000. It became painfully clear that she had no way to repay Alan. And forced to, protect himself, Alan had a promissory note drawn up, basically demanding that the money would be repaid by the end of January 2009. But as that financial web tightened, a darker thread appeared. 2 life insurance policies taken out on Dale, both for $1 million. They became a glaring focus for investigators. The policies took effect on January 1st, 2009. It was just 2 weeks later, on January 14th, that Dale was savagely attacked. Marissa's name was listed as the beneficiary on both those policies. The state would later reveal that Marissa had changed the beneficiary on the $1 million policy from herself to Alan, the very man she owed nearly $300,000 to. I mean, we will come to the evidence at trial in the next part of this case, but just that alone, I mean, come on, it is glaringly obvious, is it not? And then came a confession letter. Stan Cook claimed responsibility for Dale's death, but evidence, and we'll talk a little bit more about this at the trial, it showed that the letter had been crafted with Marissa's involvement and under the guidance of Alan Flores. Their plan was carefully calculated and all of their roles are kind of intertwined. When police executed a search warrant at Alan's house, they uncovered more than just financial documents. Among the items seized were Dale's birth certificate and his social security card. This wasn't just a tangled love triangle. This is becoming a much more disturbing connection. It is a deadly game, I think, to them that's fueled by money and deception and many other things that we'll go on to talk about. It was on February 24th, 2009 that Dale died. His official cause of death was a pulmonary embolism, a blood clot that had travelled from his leg to his lungs and ultimately starved his brain of oxygen. But it wasn't spontaneous. It was, of course, the direct result of the trauma, the blows he had sustained, the surgeries he had endured. That bleeding just could not be stopped. The charge against Marissa was upgraded to first-degree murder. Marissa was rearrested 2 days later, and this time held without bond due to the severity of the charge and the increased flight risk. But with 3 different stories circling the truth, the courtroom would become the final battleground, because the question wasn't just who had killed Dale, it was who was the jury gonna believe. This is the end of part 1 of this case. Part 2 is available right now. You can find it in the Red Run feed.